Okay, so these are ideas presented in the context of our conversation here at FAY this week. But I wanted to start by framing why I feel we're here and what really motivates my participation and engagement in the subject, which is a sense of existential crisis in the world, threat of planet-wide catastrophe in all the dimensions that we know. And I think at how I would diagnose that existential crisis would be our inability to connect in space and time, an inability to connect with other human beings across cultures, religions, races, and so forth. At this moment in time, our inability to connect with other life forms on our planet, to feel responsible for and steward of our environment in this moment, but also our inability to connect in time, our inability to see ourselves in the context of future generations and to feel connected to and responsible for preserving this earth for future generations as well. And if I would, distill the crisis of today down to a sentence, it would be that there's a critical deficit of love and empathy in the world, and a real inability to see through the eyes of others and to accept various different points of view and approaches as valid. And I think those considerations motivate what we might think of as a plan, or how do we solve all the disconnectivities and the chasms between people that exist in the world, between science-minded people, people of the heart, and people of the head, people who our lives are ruled more by logos, and those more by mythos. By logos here meant sort of a sense of the organization and rules behind the world, laws of physics, science, and those who are motivated more by story, narrative, a sacred text. Can we find a meeting point between the logos space and the mythos space? Can we find, I think even more critically, can we find a meeting point between different religions? Among those who are heart-oriented, those who are mythos-oriented, there is perhaps even a greater divide than there is between the heart space and the head space. The different cultures which have given rise to different specific spiritual paths and different theological systems which seem completely unbridgeable: monotheism, non-theism, indigenous beliefs, polytheism. All of these are thought to be irreconcilable with each other. Is it overly optimistic to imagine that there's some kind of bridge that can be built between all of these mutually irreconcilable groups? That's the optimistic thought behind this. What would such a bridge do if it could be built? Before getting into the details of what the elements might be, I think, and I will argue that such a bridge ought to have the broadest possible appeal. That is, it's something that needs to appeal, and nothing is going to appeal to 100% of humanity. We need a critical mass of humanity on board behind something. And so it has to be something that has an inclusive spirit as opposed to an exclusive spirit, recognizing at the same time that in the spiritual history of the human race, there have been different approaches to the development of spirituality, and so many examples of a more exclusive approach of going deep and having a small community around oneself that goes deep. But I would argue that the real need for today, if we're going to bridge all of these divides, is to find something that is fundamentally inclusive in its approach. Such a bridge also should emphasize the interconnectedness of everything. Interconnectedness both in space and in time. So between people, but also in a sort of, in the sense of of being stewards of the planet for the future as well. Of course, it has to make space for the heart and the head, and it needs to suggest, but not define, an underlying ethic. Out of this bridge ought to come something that helps to orient human actions in the world, not just something that's a theoretical construct, but something that helps give us a litmus test, a sense of, well, if this is how I view the world, then it makes sense that I would act in this way instead of that way. So there ought to be that practical result at the end of it. And I would argue further that that practical result in general ought to be something outward facing and universal, something about love for one's neighbor extended outward to the boundaries of the planet, because that's the need for today. But that doesn't ignore the need for inner work as well. And of course, it has to preserve a sense of mystery and wonder. It can't just be a kind of a rational scheme, but there has to be mystery behind it. Whatever narrative that we were talking about is not going to be an exact science. I don't think it's going to be an exact system. It's going to be something which is inspiring. It may be a little vague and fuzzy at the edges, but it's not its job, I think, to be a science. It's its job to onboard as many people as possible into collective action on the planet. One of the most famous attempts at a systematic cosmology, at a sort of vision for the world that has been very influential over many centuries, is Plato's Timaeus, which, if you've read the Timaeus, has a lot of weird elements to it. I mean, it starts with this demiurge that creates the world, but then it delves into these hermaphroditic creatures with 4 arms and 4 legs that roll around and get split apart. And so there are these fantastical elements to the Timaeus of Plato. And Plato, of course, is super logical. And in Timaeus, he sort of gives himself, for the moment, time and space to just tell a story. And he kind of explains at the beginning that, that what we're doing here is not giving an exact description, but it's a probabilistic narrative, a likely narrative. And it's in that spirit, I think, that we should proceed. And also, I think in the spirit of likely narrative is that one way to think about what we need to do is not so much produce a topographically precise picture of the physical world, of the world of nature and of all the people that populate the world, but rather what we're looking at is something more like a subway map that is useful at getting from point A to point B. It helps us navigate the human world in useful, moral, pro-social ways. And as we know, subway maps are not known for being exceptionally accurate to the underlying topography. It's just not a feature of subway maps, but that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to help us navigate a different dimension, a dimension of consciousness, which is the dimension of the human world. And so what ultimately recommends it then is it useful? Is it the most efficient way of getting us from point A to point B? Not, is it the best possible clinical description of things? In this vein also, it ought to admit of multiple takes or lenses. It should be able to be viewed by different people in different ways. And Gibbon had a kind of snarky but brilliant way, as Gibbon was, of describing how religion was seen in the Roman world at the end of the Roman Empire. And he said it was considered by the people as equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful. And a little bit more on this, on my personal sense that the narrative building that needs to be done has to be a kind of inclusive narrative. I have to give a shout out to a poet laureate of Oregon, my home state, and let Oregon have a word in this. But it's from a poem by Edwin Markham that I think really captures this idea of inclusivity. He said, he drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, a rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that drew him in. And also touching on an idea which has been active here at FAE in this past week is also, and this is a conversation that we can have maybe out in the open, is spirituality a matter of having a certain kind of experience, or is it something else? And this idea of having an experience has been discussed by philosophers and people in the religious sphere across the world over many centuries. Plotinus had a take on it, which I think is very a useful contribution to this, which really dissociates the experience of something from the thing itself that we're going for. And if we're going for the good, as all the ancient Greeks are, Plotinus points out that certainly the good which one chooses must be something which is not the feeling one has when one attains it. That is why the one who takes this for good remains empty, because he only has the feeling which one might get from the good. So there's certainly a logical distinction to be drawn between the two. So what I want to offer in the following slides is it's what we might call a candidate meta-narrative that proposes to build these various bridges, at least the starting point of looking at how these bridges might be built between these various groups. And I would sum it up as a cosmology of love. We can call it the ontological circle or the circle of existence. And as we'll see as we look at various implications of it, it invites a mapping of a large number of scientific and religious concepts, which are some of the key ideas in certainly in history of religious thought and key ideas in science, and maps them onto each other. This idea is based on the teachings of the Baha'i faith, but it draws from multiple ancient and modern sources, and you can find all of these ideas in many places. So there's really, I don't think anything truly new here. But perhaps the most pithy explanation of it from a Baha'i source, from Abdul Baha, is that the material worlds terminate at the end of the arc of descent, that the station of man lies at the end of the arc of descent and the beginning of the arc of ascent, which is opposite the supreme center, and that from the beginning to the end of the arc of ascent, the degrees of progress are of a spiritual nature. So one way of thinking about this kind of cosmological view, first off, is that it incorporates material and spiritual in a kind of complementary sense. And secondly, that the two can be thought of as forming a kind of a circle. And so that's the first element of this, is that the circle is a kind of infinitely self-generative, creative thing. It's a dynamic thing. It is, in a Neoplatonian sense, a matter of emanation from and return to in complementary movements. In religious language, we can say this is God loving the world, creating the world to be loved in that kind of reciprocal motion of love as source and goal. It's also religious language in the logos of the Gospel of John being that word which brings creation into being and then becomes manifest in the world. Philosophically, Plato talks about this, the demiurge, which we've already mentioned, and of course the emanation of the Neoplatonic one. There is compatible and complementary scientific language, I think, for exactly the same thing, which is John Wheeler's idea of it from bit. And I have a slide on this in just in a few slides, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But first of all, this idea of the circle of existence as being a useful cosmological metaphor that helps to bring together a lot of ideas is common to many cultures, many belief systems over time. This is a particularly good example of it in the alchemical tradition, And this is from the oldest preserved alchemical text from 3rd or 4th century AD, the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, the alchemist. Inside it says all is one in Greek. And it also is divided into dark and light halves, kind of the arc of descent and the arc of ascent, if you will, which represent the complementary principles of life and death, mind and matter. And the swallowing of the tail at the end is an important part of the whole picture, because it illustrates this dynamic equivalence of origin and end. So we have in this image the idea of mind generating matter, which in turn generates mind, and also an image of continual transformation. Imagery of the Ouroboros, which is what this is found in so many different places. I just have a few examples here. An early one in the tomb of Tutankhamun. We have this image also in Hindu cosmology surrounding the elephants and the turtles that hold up the world. We have an example in Norse mythology of the world serpent, which is also surrounding the world and not so much visible in this manuscript, but the idea is that this serpent is also swallowing its tail and surrounding the world. I'd mentioned earlier it from bit, which I think is the modern kind of physics equivalent of this circle of existence, of this Ouroboros principle. And you have the letter U representing the universe. The eyeball at the end is us, having evolved here after 14 billion years of cosmic evolution. And then the dotted line looking back at the beginning. And so our observation of the first moments of existence in Wheeler's idea, in a kind of quantum mechanical sense, where quantum measurement resolves ambiguities, collapses a wave function, so to speak. His idea was that somehow our knowledge of, observation of, awareness of the earliest moments of in the existence of our universe are in some way creative of it. That there's a participatory universe that we're part of, and that this makes consciousness both in some way an origin and an endpoint for things. So that's so I want to go through then in the next slides a bunch of principles that meld into this. But if you don't like the imagery of the Ouroboros and find it kind of strange, it's not that common to us in the West. You can also think about these ideas, the set of ideas that follow independently of that imagery of the snake swallowing its tail. But I would point out, first of all, though, this aspect of the circle of existence is comprising life and death, composition and decomposition, is I think one way of completing the incompleteness of the present picture of physical cosmology, which is really all about the death part, so to speak. Death here being also a word for entropy, which is all that physics really recognizes on a sort of on the largest level as what's happening with matter and material systems, is that entropy is increasing. That's really all we can say about the world in terms of process, which seems to leave out life and consciousness, which seem to be an example of entropy decreasing in time. This kind of hole in cosmological theory, which was of course there in the ancient cosmology, is all about purpose and meaning in life. That hole, you can try to fill that hole in various ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But one way to try to think about it is that life and death are generative of each other, that there is complementary to entropy at the largest scales, something generative in the universe, something like a teleological principle, which, just like entropy, is invisible to any kind of laboratory experiments you might concoct at a local scale. You're never going to find anything other than the four forces of nature: your gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces. They simply, nothing beyond that is going to appear in, say, a particle accelerator, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. Just like entropy is not there in the particle accelerator, but when you look at the action of matter on large scales, suddenly you realize there's something at work here that tends towards disorder. At the same time, our experience of the world around us shows us that there's something else at work that tends towards order. And so the uniting of these two arcs and the addition of that, as a complementary principle, I think is an important piece of this. Whitehead talks about the principle of coercion, the principle of persuasion, as being something that Plato talked about at the end of his life. He said it should be looked upon as one of the greatest intellectual discoveries in the history of religion, that this shift of our thinking about the divine element of the world, conceived of as a coercive agency and then becoming a persuasive agency. It's another way of thinking about the arcs of ascent and descent. The arc of descent is the law of nature, the mathematical rules that govern things that are coercive in the sense that you can't contravene them. But the arc of ascent is characterized complementarily as a persuasive energy agency, as something which invites us, something that, of our own free will, we traverse that path, versus the path that we traverse to get here at this moment in physical time was the ineluctable forces of nature that drove the evolutionary process that brought us into being. That kind of moment where the arc of descent becomes the arc of ascent can be thought of allegorically as the story of Adam and Eve, the birth of consciousness, the birth of free will in humanity. And since that moment, we've been returning, traversing the arc of ascent, but through our own free will. This circle, the motion of this circle is dynamic, it's in continuous motion. What propels the motion? In religious language, we can say it's love. Hate, of course, is the opposite direction of the circle. Love is what drives the movement of that circle in the emanative arcs that Plotinus talks about. But the scientific language for that same principle are the attractive and repulsive forces of nature, which have mathematical expressions for them. This, we can say in a way that gravitation is love. The attraction between particles is love, expressed in the degree of existence that in the sort of lowest degree of existence, and that at higher degrees of existence, this force of love manifests itself in different ways, but the essence of it is always the same. Another principle is that the motion within the circle is not just random, but it's structured. There's something that gives form to it. The motion is constrained by ordered relationships. And here again, we have two different sets of languages that kind of map onto each other. In religious language, we can talk about God's will, we can talk about Dharma. There's various other words for this. That which sort of undergirds and gives structure to processes. And of course, in scientific language, those are the mathematical laws of nature. Another set of concepts having to do with the motion of the circle, also not just being random elements that are atomically separate from each other, but everything is intimately connected in this journey from the source and back to the source. Again, we have religious language for this interconnectedness of things, the teau, the great chain of being, which is more, I think, a philosophical term. In scientific language, we have quantum entanglement. We have systems theory and ecosystems, and any kind of scientific, even down to condensed matter theory, which is already looking at matter in the aggregate in some way. So we have also a mapping of sciences of interconnectedness onto the interconnectedness that is also there in the religious sense. What is the circle made of? What is the ontology of the circle? Are we talking about a material universe or spiritual universe? Are we talking about Cartesian dualism here? Are we talking about some form of idealism where it's all spirit, it's all consciousness? And this is where I think the circle of existence metaphor is particularly useful and powerful, because within the context of the circle of existence, we human beings are located at a certain point on that circle, because it's an evolutionary circle and we're at a point evolution of consciousness. Once you locate yourself on the circle of existence, there is something that's in front of you and there's something that's behind you, because you've traversed various degrees around that circle. And that's one way of resolving this kind of weird Cartesian dualism of substance dualism. Well, if spirit is a thing, then where's the spiritual substance? And you look for it and you can't find it. But a spirit is really more a directionality of things. It's what's in front of us along the journey of consciousness, and matter and the material is what's behind us. It's the road that we've already traversed. In that sense, we transcend the limitations both of Cartesian dualism, where spirit and matter are separate, and all of the problems that raises. But we also transcend the sort of it's all one, substance, the idealism also of other forms of thought. We certainly transcend the materialist lens of everything is just matter, and spirit and mind is purely epiphenomenal. It gives both of them a kind of ontological status. At the same time, there's a oneness behind it. So then also connected to this kind of, it introduces the idea of relativity of truth, because your perspective as you're traversing this circle, your perspective on reality and truth differs. And this is where I think the perspective of spirituality as a series of stages, a series of openings, is a valid one, because there are greater and lesser degrees of openings of consciousness, and what is true from one degree of opening may seem false from another degree, and vice versa. This is one place where the Baha'i writings, I think, make a particularly eloquent point about that, and talking about the mystic path, not just as being traversal of degrees by a single individual from ignorance to enlightenment, but rather what the Baha'i writings do, and what Baha'u'llah does, is validate each of these degrees as being complete and perfect within their own station, as a real necessary prerequisite to attaining a kind of unity in the world. If we're always divided into those who are, we don't want to replicate the idea of there being superior and inferior groups. We want to find a way to recognize the perfection of each of the stages. Is a baby more perfect than an adult? Even though the adult is more developed, we often talk about babies as being more perfect. Somehow the imperfections come along later. But as we traverse the stages of our own existence, there isn't a sort of intrinsic superiority of one stage over the other. And this idea also, there's a mapping here. In religious language, we can talk about bringing things together. Those may not be all the right terms, but you can talk about forget what I even said about religious language. It's more about the scientific language of relativity being both relativity in the sense of Einstein's theory of relativity, but also the relativity which is intrinsic in quantum mechanics of the observer affecting a system by the act of observation, and therefore every observer's description of a particular phenomenon is going to differ, both because the act of observing it alters it, but also, on the other side, on the relativity side, because one's trajectory in space-time gives oneself also a different perspective than everyone else who has different trajectories in space-time. But behind these different perspectives lies a unity that brings them together. Somewhere, and this is kind of an elephant in the room in this conversation, it hasn't really come up yet here at Faye this week. What's the role of the prophet, the sage? Historically, every religious system has been brought into being through an active divine revelation of a particular inspired person. A prophet brings a book, claims to speak with divine authority, and that gives the the ideas that are brought, a kind of force and a power in the world, which seems difficult for a mere philosophy to achieve. And when we're thinking about what is going to actually move the needle in the world, is a good set of philosophical ideas going to move that needle? Or is it going to take something that is at least perceived to have divine sanction? And that's where, going back to this idea of, from Gibbon, maybe different people are going to see it in different ways. Maybe some people are going to see it as divine revelation. Other people will look at it and say, I'm not so sure about the divine revelation piece, but it's useful, and and I have no objection to it. And so you might have various people being able to sort of enter into a sort of a common framework, even though some might view it very differently than others. And here also you have a mapping of language. In religious language, we talk about the prophet as a divine revelator, as one who brings down a message that was, as it were, whispered in their ear and then translated onto the page. But in scientific language, we can talk about geniuses, just as mysterious. The genius of a Mozart writing great works of music starting at age 6, or people who can play chess and become grandmasters at early ages and so forth. How do we explain this potentiality of the human mind, which seems almost magical to us? Is that special magical power of the prophet or sage a kind of human genius? A human genius, a genius in the human realm, a genius in understanding the interconnectedness and the sort of laws that govern at the level of human relationships, and is able to express those in ways that later become codified into religious systems. And finally, this question of progression of stages within the circle. There are stages. There is, there are more advanced and less advanced perspectives. In religious language, we talk about a spiritual path or mystical path that is complementary to the path of evolution in the world, both cosmic and biological, and to this phenomenon of emergence, which is more and more a scientific topic in recent decades. So if this seems like a plausible narrative, this idea of a circle of existence which tries to acknowledge, validate, and find a complementary place for matter and spirit, what are some challenges to this? And the primary challenge that I can think of, and I'm sure there are many more, but the primary challenge I can think of is that one of these depicts a universe which is essentially purposeless. It's run blindly by mathematical law, and the other is infused with purpose. It's all about purpose. Is a purposive universe and a purposeless universe, are these two things really compatible? Is it possible that this is just a hard contradiction, we can't get around it? And I can think of two strategies to try to resolve it. And there's a good discussion to be had here, I think. And the first strategy is, well, there is purpose in the universe, and we've just overlooked it. So we have to go find it. And there are a lot of attempts to find that overlooked purpose in nature, that life force, that thing that complements entropy. You have, Tononi's integrated information theory, just to throw out a few. Jeremy England, 2 years ago, had an idea based on free energy that also explains somehow how life and complexity emerges in these otherwise entropic systems. You have ideas of panpsychism, which is kind of recently come back into vogue in philosophical circles. And of course, you have the question of paranormal phenomena. Maybe matter is an actual force in the world, can be measured, can be brought within the ambit of the scientific method. If so, this is an important question. It needs to be looked at critically, particularly in light of the great potential for confirmation bias in this kind of research. It's so difficult to do research on consciousness when it's a conscious being that's doing the research. It makes it a uniquely difficult problem scientifically, because the object of the study is the same as the object doing the study. And we know from quantum mechanics, there's no way, for that to happen without the observation changing in some fundamental way, the thing being observed. And if that's the case, that's the case with consciousness, it makes for a very difficult thing. But that's one sort of avenue of approach, would be to try to bring that, to find that purpose somewhere ultimately in the realm of nature. A second avenue, and I suppose tipping my hand in admitting this is where I find the most likely and fruitful approach, is to see purpose and non-purpose as complementary frames of reference, not as being opposites, and you have to somehow affirm one and deny the other, but show that both purpose and non-purpose are complementary frames of reference. To put it in Aristotelian terms, we're talking about an efficient cause and a final cause. The efficient cause is the mathematical laws of physics picture, which is drives everything from moment to moment and gives us that structure. The final cause of Aristotle is that goal to which things seek. And that was a very popular way of looking at the world prior to the advent of modern science. Once modern science came along, final causes kind of got ushered out the door, and efficient causes became the sort of reigning paradigm. But it's an interesting point that even, and this is something which I find curiously not discussed more, and that is that even within the framework of classical physics, so set aside quantum mechanics, set aside general relativity and everything that happened in the 20th century, already in the 1700s, there was a way of formulating Newton's laws, not in the differential form that we learned in our first year physics class, F equals ma, and measuring accelerations and time increments and all of that, and thinking about all phenomena as sort of proceeding from one moment to the next according to these laws of physics, which is more like thinking about it in terms of efficient causes. But it was shown in the 1700s that this formulation of the mathematical laws of physics is identical to, produces identical results to another formulation of these same laws of physics, which are in integral form, which write down a certain quantity called an action, which is the difference between essentially the kinetic and potential energy of the system. And if that quantity over a certain path you look at that quantity sort of integrated over a path, you'll find that quantity is always minimized. Technically, it hits an extremum, but in practice, it's always minimized, which is a strange, almost sort of through the back door, final causes come back in. Because through the Lagrangian picture of mechanics, it's as though everything in the universe moves such that it minimizes the action, which is a very kind of teleological way of thinking about the universe. But of course, it's not teleological. It's not that some being out there is saying, okay, this particle do that and that particle do that. It's a kind of internal teleology, but it's a teleological principle nonetheless. And it's mathematically identical to this totally non-teleological Newtonian picture, which is much more akin to the efficient cause of Aristotle. So this is one example just from classical physics, where what we intuitively might think of as like two different, maybe incompatible matrices of thinking, in terms of purpose and in terms of purposelessness, actually end up being mathematically identical to each other. And so the idea of even purpose and purposelessness becomes more a function of how we think about the world rather than something which is intrinsic to the world itself. So this is one way of trying to reconcile what otherwise might be objected to as a challenge to this sort of this attempt at meta-narrative construction, which tries to bring in life and death as somehow being complementary principles of the world. So just as an example of how important narrative construction is, these are two scientists who share an atheistic worldview, share a materialistic worldview, but just look at the difference in the narrative construction between Stephen Hawking, who says the human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet, orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. And the narrative construction of a Carl Sagan, who says we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. You can take the same set of facts and arrange it in such different ways to either highlight or deprecate life and consciousness. And I'll just close on that note. So.